Cody Brown just revealed the shocking truth about his kids, his ex Christine, and his entire family, and it is far darker than anyone imagined. He calls his own children Christine's kids and justifies his bitterness and neglect because of her leaving. But the real story is even more twisted, as favoritism, jealousy, and manipulation run through every part of his life. You won't believe what he admitted about past holidays, the family homes, and how he treats his wives. This is the side of Cody Brown no one expected, and you're about to see every disturbing detail revealed. Imagine for a moment being caught in the whirlwind of someone else's reality, someone who refuses to see the world beyond themselves, someone who is still trapped in the shadow of the past. And as you watch this episode, you realize just how twisted this story really is. The way Cody speaks about Christine is not only shocking, but it reveals a man who refuses to take responsibility for the very life he helped create. And what struck me first is how he refers to the children as Christine's kids, as though they exist outside of him, as though they are not his own flesh and blood. And then his brother intervenes and corrects him, and it is such a small but monumental moment, because in that moment you see the fragility of a man who cannot even claim his own children as his own. And the way he speaks about Christine leaving, the anger, the bitterness, the resentment is palpable. You can almost feel it, seeping through the screen like a toxin that infects every word he says. And he cannot finish a single thought without twisting it into a justification for his own failures. And this is what makes the whole situation so unnerving, because you are watching someone who refuses to own their mistakes, someone who deflects every ounce of responsibility onto someone else, and then layers upon layers of narrative are added as he explains how he was devoted to polygamy and to the principles of his faith, but not to the women individually, how he collected relationships like trophies, how the women themselves were merely placeholders for an ideal, rather than partners in a marriage. And this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing, because it is not just about anger or resentment. It is about a system that dehumanizes people and reduces them to concepts. And as he explains the frustration he felt at Christine for leaving, you can almost hear the echo of entitlement in his voice, the expectation that she should remain because of him, because of the life they built, but never acknowledging that she was a person with feelings, with agency, with desires that did not align with his vision. And then the children enter the frame, and suddenly everything is magnified, because the children are not just collateral damage. They are the living proof of the choices made, and the way he justifies neglecting them because of his anger towards their mother is shocking. It is vindictive. It is cruel. It is a pattern that continues throughout the episode, as he shifts the blame, as he projects guilt onto others. And you are left wondering how someone could be so blind to the consequences of their own actions. How someone could view the people who depend on them as extensions of conflict rather than human beings with their own emotions. And in the same breath, he discusses Robin, his current partner, and the way he justifies keeping her safe as though it were a heroic act, as though protecting her from jealousy and resentment absolves him of the mistreatment of the past, as though securing a house and financial stability for one person erases the trauma he caused to the others. And it is in these contradictions, in these glaring hypocrisies, that the drama unfolds, and you are compelled to watch, because every statement he makes, every attempt to rewrite history, every excuse, every manipulation draws you deeper into a story that is equal parts infuriating and mesmerizing, and the suspense builds, because you know there is more to come. There are layers yet to be peeled back, revelations waiting to explode, and the way he describes past holidays as poison, as though memories of joy and connection are tainted and ruined. By bitterness and rage, you realize that this is someone trapped in a cycle, unable to see the beauty in life, unable to reconcile with the past, unable to acknowledge the humanity of others. And as the episode continues, you cannot help but feel the tension, the rawness, the chaos, because nothing about this narrative is neat. Nothing about it is simple. Everything is entangled in emotion, in ego, in pride, in anger, and it is in these tangled webs that the drama lives and breathes, and you watch, captivated, horrified, enthralled, wanting to see just how far the story will go. Wanting to see whether there is redemption, whether there is accountability, whether there is even a shred of clarity amidst the storm. And as he talks about the homes, the finances, the equity taken, the jealousy, the anger, the perceived betrayals, you realize the complexity of human relationships and the devastating impact of selfishness and entitlement. And you realize that every statement, every action has ripple effects that extend beyond the individual that harm those who least deserve it: the children, the women, the family. And it is in the intersection of these moments of vulnerability and selfishness that the suspense reaches its peak, because you cannot look away from the unfolding drama, and yet every time you think you understand his perspective, he twists it. You are forced to question your own judgment, to parse truth from narrative, to separate cruelty from justification. And as the camera lingers on his expressions, on the pauses, on the incomplete sentences, you can feel the tension building, the dramatic irony layering upon itself, until the suspense is unbearable, and you are left waiting for what comes next, for the revelation, for the breakdown, for the confrontation, for the moment where reality collides with narrative. And as the story progresses, the internal monologue you carry as a viewer grows heavier and heavier, because the implications are enormous, not just for him, not just for his relationships, but for the audience who witnesses this unraveling of character and morality, and the way in which privilege and ego allow a person to manipulate narrative to protect themselves while disregarding the emotional fallout for everyone else. And as you continue watching, you feel the pulse of drama, the heartbeat of suspense, as each statement, each justification, each recollection adds weight to the story, and you cannot turn away because you sense that the truth is layered within these chaotic fragments that the story itself demands to be untangled and confronted, and you are trapped in this spiral of suspense, of revelation, of judgment and reflection, and every word, every sentence, every incomplete thought becomes a thread in the tapestry of a narrative that is compelling, shocking, and utterly human in its flaws, in its brutality, in its contradictions. And you are compelled to watch to the very end to witness the full arc of this unraveling of relationships, of accountability, of power and control, of love and resentment, and everything that lies in between. And then there is the psychological unraveling that becomes more evident as the episode progresses, the anger, the jealousy, the persistent bitterness that colors every interaction that Cody has with Christine's children, with Robin, with his brother, with the audience itself. And as you listen to him speak, the sense of entitlement, the inability to see beyond himself, the projection of blame onto others becomes almost suffocating, because you realize that this is not just an individual flaw, this is a pattern, a worldview, a lens through which every experience is filtered, and it is deeply disturbing because it illustrates the magnitude of self-deception and the danger of refusing to acknowledge responsibility. And as he recounts the times when Christine expressed her desire to leave polygamy, to live a monogamous life, to step away from a system that she did not believe in, you see him dismissing her perspective, minimizing her feelings, rationalizing her choices as though her agency is irrelevant. And the children, again, are caught in the crossfire because their needs, their emotional well-being is secondary to the ego and pride of a man unwilling to confront his own mistakes. And the way he discusses the past, the house, the equity, the jealousy, the anger, the manipulation, the control over resources, the hierarchy among women, the favoritism, the resentment towards other wives, the justification for keeping Robin safe, as though protection is transactional, as though love is measured by financial control and security rather than emotional support. And the way he describes past events with selective memory, with embellishment, with rationalization, makes you question what is truth, what is narrative, what is distortion. And it is this constant tension between revelation and obfuscation that keeps you on the edge of your seat, that fuels the suspense. Because you know there is more to the story, more to uncover, more to dissect, and you cannot stop watching. Because every statement is a puzzle, every justification a reflection of internal conflict, and every reflection on the children a testament to the consequences of his choices. And as he speaks about holidays as poison, as though memory itself is tainted by bitterness and unresolved anger, you realize that he has created a world in which he is the victim, in which his perspective is the only one that matters, in which others are instruments for his narrative. And as he continues, you see the web of control, of manipulation, of ego become more complex, more intertwined, more suffocating, because nothing exists in isolation. Nothing exists without the influence of his interpretation. And as you watch his expressions, as you hear the incomplete sentences, as you notice the contradictions, you are drawn deeper into the drama, because the tension builds, the suspense intensifies, the sense of unease grows, and you feel compelled to continue. Because the stakes are human stakes, emotional stakes, moral stakes, and the unfolding narrative demands engagement, it demands scrutiny, it demands reflection on the human capacity for denial, for self-deception, for projection, for cruelty, And you cannot look away because you sense that the resolution is somewhere ahead, that the climax is inevitable, that the reckoning must come. And yet he continues to rationalize, to manipulate, to twist, to deflect, to rewrite history, and you are held in this state of suspended judgment, of suspended tension, of suspended disbelief. And the suspense is not just in the story itself, but in the anticipation of the viewer of what will happen when truth collides with narrative, when ego collides with accountability, when the past confronts the present. And as you watch, you feel the weight of emotional trauma, the weight of betrayal, the weight of disappointment, the weight of anger, and it is amplified by the public nature of the revelations, the accessibility of his statements, the magnitude of the consequences for the children, for Christine, for Robin, for the audience itself. And as you move through the narrative, you begin to notice the subtle psychological patterns, the defense mechanisms, the rationalizations, the avoidance of responsibility, the projection of blame, the twisting of events to suit personal narrative, the selective memory, the emotional manipulation, the justification for controlling others, the minimization of harm, the rationalization of cruelty, and all of this comes together to create a story that is equal parts psychological study and moral cautionary tale, and you are compelled to keep watching because the suspense is layered, the narrative is complex, the stakes are high, and every new revelation adds depth and weight to the story. As you realize that human behavior is messy, unpredictable, morally ambiguous, and yet endlessly compelling, and you are drawn into the web because it is a mirror of what can happen when ego dominates empathy, when pride dominates compassion, when self-interest dominates accountability. And as he continues to speak, the tension escalates because you cannot predict the next justification, the next rationalization, the next attempt to rewrite history, the next instance of cruelty or neglect. And it is this unpredictability, this human fallibility, this moral ambiguity that makes the story utterly mesmerizing and horrific simultaneously, because you are watching someone struggle with their own demons and yet create suffering for others, and you feel the suspense because you do not know whether he will ever recognize the impact of his actions, whether he will ever confront his own failings, whether there will ever be accountability, whether there will ever be reconciliation. And the suspense is heightened by the very human frustration of watching someone repeat patterns of behavior that are destructive, harmful, cruel, and yet justified in their own mind. And it is this tension between the unfolding narrative and the moral evaluation of the viewer that creates a dynamic, compelling, and suspenseful experience that is difficult to turn away from, difficult to ignore, and impossible to stop analyzing, as every statement, every memory, every reflection, every incomplete thought adds another layer of depth, complexity, and suspense to a story that is as psychologically revealing as it is morally challenging. As the story unfolds further, you begin to realize that Cody's narrative is not just about anger or jealousy. It is a reflection of a man completely unwilling to face reality, to take responsibility, to acknowledge the emotional impact of his decisions. And the way he discusses the past, the children, the holidays, the homes, the equity and the jealousy, the resentment, the favoritism, the control of resources, the manipulation of partners, the hierarchy among women, the rationalizations for anger and cruelty reveals the deep psychological mechanisms that drive him, and you cannot help but notice the chilling consistency with which he prioritizes his ego over empathy, his self-interest over accountability, his narrative over truth. And it is in the repeated patterns, the incomplete thoughts, the twisting of history, the justification of selfish behavior that the drama reaches another level of intensity. Because every word, every expression, every pause is loaded with suspense, with anticipation, with the possibility of revelation or contradiction. And as he continues to explain how Christine left, how he felt betrayed, how the children are somehow collateral damage, it becomes painfully clear that his perception of the world is filtered through the lens of self-preservation, filtered through a relentless need to be seen as righteous, as justified, as morally superior. And this in turn amplifies the drama, because you as a viewer are left piecing together the reality behind the rationalizations, questioning the motives, interpreting the silences, and parsing the emotional subtext. And it is in this constant oscillation between what is said and what is implied that suspense builds, because every narrative choice, every word, every justification could be a clue to the deeper truth about character, about morality, about consequence. And as you watch him speak about Robin, about keeping her safe, about the jealousy of the other women, about the financial arrangements, about the house, about the equity, about the mortgages, about favoritism, about past holidays, about bitterness, about anger, about resentment. You begin to see the layers of human emotion at play, the intertwining of privilege, power control, manipulation, entitlement, expectation, obligation. And yet you also see the human capacity for self-deception, the inability to recognize wrongdoing, the twisting of history to serve ego, the projection of blame onto others, the minimization of harm. And it is this tension between human fallibility and moral responsibility that keeps the suspense so taut, because you are waiting for the moment when accountability will collide with denial, when truth will challenge narrative, when history will confront ego. And yet he continues to evade, to rationalize, to justify, to manipulate, and the suspense continues to build as the story oscillates between revelation and distortion, between cruelty and rationalization, between truth and perception, and you cannot help but feel the weight of the emotional stakes for the children, for Christine, for Robin, for the other wives, for the audience itself, as the narrative lays bare the consequences of choices, actions, inactions, and the ripple effects of selfishness, entitlement, and disregard for others. And as Cody discusses his perspective on past holidays as poison, as though memories themselves are tainted and ruined by anger and bitterness, you begin to grasp the magnitude of self-deception and emotional manipulation, the way a narrative can be twisted to absolve responsibility, the way memory can be weaponized to justify cruelty, the way human relationships can be distorted by ego, and you are compelled to watch because every incomplete thought, every justification, every recollection adds to the suspense, to the tension, to the complexity of the story, because it is not just about what is happening, but why it is happening, about the psychology of the individual, the morality of the choices, the consequences for others. And it is this layering of suspense, of psychological depth, of moral evaluation that keeps you riveted, because you are constantly anticipating the next revelation, the next rationalization, the next twist, the next instance of cruelty, the next justification, the next fragment of memory that will reshape your understanding and deepen the drama. And it is in this ongoing tension between unfolding narrative and viewer interpretation that the story maintains its grip on your attention, drawing you deeper into the web of human emotion, ego manipulation, power, control, entitlement, jealousy, anger, and unresolved trauma. And every time you think you have a grasp on his perspective, another contradiction emerges, another justification surfaces, another act of avoidance or projection is revealed, and the suspense compounds. Because you are witnessing the human psyche in a raw, unfiltered form, a man refusing to confront himself while creating consequences for everyone around him, and the psychological tension, the moral ambiguity, the unpredictability of narrative keeps you from turning away, compelling you to continue watching, to piece together the story, to evaluate character, to analyze motive, to understand consequence, to witness the unraveling of relationships and the cascading effects of decisions driven by ego, by entitlement, by self-interest. And it is in this sustained tension, in this layering of drama and suspense, in the interplay between narrative and reality, that the story holds your attention, because you sense that resolution is uncertain, that revelation is inevitable, that confrontation may be imminent, and every detail, every reflection, every fragment of memory, every incomplete sentence adds to the suspense intensity and complexity of the narrative, drawing you further into a story that is as psychologically revealing as it is morally challenging, as it is dramatic and shocking and utterly human in its imperfections, contradictions, and consequences. As the final layers of the narrative begin to unfold, you realize that Cody's story is not just a tale of anger, jealousy, or resentment. It is a masterclass in human ego self-deception and the consequences of prioritizing self-interest over empathy, over accountability, over morality. And as he speaks about Christine, about Robin, about the children, about the past, about holidays, about homes, about equity, about favoritism, about jealousy, about control, about power, about responsibility, about avoidance, about projection, about justification, about manipulation, you begin to feel the immense weight of the narrative, the moral stakes, the emotional stakes, the suspense that builds. Because every word, every incomplete sentence, every twist of memory, every rationalization, every reflection on past events becomes a piece of the puzzle that you as a viewer are compelled to assemble, to understand, to evaluate, to anticipate, to reflect. And it is in this tension between the story he tells and the consequences that it reveals that the drama becomes almost unbearable. because you are watching someone unable to confront their own failures, while creating consequences for others while projecting blame and rationalizing cruelty, and the suspense is sustained, because you never know what revelation will come next, what contradiction will surface, what act of emotional manipulation will emerge, what justification will twist reality further, what reflection will deepen the moral complexity, what memory will reveal unacknowledged truth, what silence will speak volumes about denial and avoidance. And it is in this web of human emotion, manipulation, ego, entitlement, anger, jealousy, control, self-interest, and avoidance that the story achieves its most dramatic and shocking moments, because every narrative choice, every justification, every incomplete thought, every rationalization, every reflection is layered with suspense, tension, and anticipation. And as he continues to speak about the children, the holidays, the homes, the equity, the favoritism, the jealousy, the manipulation, the control, the past, the trauma, the anger, the bitterness, the avoidance of accountability, the projection of blame, the rationalizations, the distortions of history, the twisting of memory, the minimization of harm, the prioritization of self-interest over empathy, over morality, over responsibility. You begin to grasp the full magnitude of human fallibility and the devastating impact it can have on relationships, on families, on lives, on children. And the suspense intensifies because you as a viewer are fully engaged, trying to parse the narrative from reality, trying to separate the distortions from the truths, trying to interpret motives, trying to assess the consequences. And it is in this constant oscillation between revelation and distortion, between cruelty and justification, between accountability and avoidance, between ego and morality, that suspense is sustained, that attention is held, that engagement is maximized. Because you never know what will happen next. What statement will reveal truth? What justification will reveal denial? What reflection will reveal projection? What silence will reveal avoidance? What pause will reveal inner conflict? And as Cody discusses, Robin about keeping her safe, about the jealousy, about financial arrangements, about past holidays, about the bitterness, about anger, about favoritism, about equity, about homes, about past trauma, about resentment, about manipulation, about emotional neglect, about rationalization, about projection, about avoidance, you realize that the story is a complex web of human behavior, a psychological study, a moral cautionary tale, a suspenseful drama, a narrative that challenges viewers to reflect, evaluate, anticipate, and emotionally invest. And the tension is relentless because every narrative turn, every reflection, every incomplete thought, every justification, every recollection, every rationalization, every instance of self-preservation creates suspense, builds drama, intensifies emotional stakes, forces moral evaluation, and keeps you watching, captivated, horrified, enthralled, compelled to continue to witness unraveling, to understand the psychological mechanisms, to assess consequences, to anticipate revelation, to evaluate morality, to parse truth, to understand human fallibility. And it is in this sustained layering of suspense drama, moral evaluation, psychological analysis, narrative complexity, and emotional intensity that the story reaches its full impact, drawing viewers deeper, deeper into the web of human ego, self-deception, manipulation, entitlement, anger, jealousy, control, avoidance, projection, and the relentless consequences of prioritizing self-interest over empathy, morality, and accountability. In the end, the story leaves you with a complex tapestry of emotion, human fallibility, and moral consequence, a narrative that is at once shocking, dramatic, suspenseful, and deeply reflective. As you watch Cody navigate his anger, his entitlement, his inability to take accountability, and his manipulation of narrative and memory, you cannot help but feel the tension, the suspense, the emotional weight, because every choice, every justification, every incomplete thought, every rationalization creates ripple effects that impact not just him, but everyone around him. And it becomes painfully clear that human relationships are fragile, that ego and pride can distort perception, and that the consequences of self-interest and entitlement can be devastating for children, partners, families, and communities. And yet it is also a story of revelation, of insight, of reflection, because as a viewer, you are forced to consider the ways in which accountability, denial, and projection interact, the Ways in which past actions and unresolved emotions shape present behavior. The ways in which memory and narrative can be twisted to serve ego and avoid responsibility. And the suspense is not just in the story itself, but in your own engagement, as you anticipate the next justification, the next rationalization, the next revelation, the next fragment of memory, the next act of manipulation. And it is this layering of narrative complexity, psychological depth, moral ambiguity, and emotional tension that makes the story compelling and unmissable, that makes you unable to turn away, and that ensures that every word, every statement, every reflection carries weight, because it reveals not just the story of one man, but universal truths about human behavior choices, consequences, and accountability, leaving you captivated, compelled, reflective, and fully immersed until the very end.